So, if you don't mind, I thought I'd open with just a bit of a self-reflective story that maybe indicates some of the complexity of the topic that we're about to address. I had a colleague of mine make me an AI large language model system over the last year, and I trained it on, I've written 4 books, and I trained it on all 4 of them on top of, I think the model was based originally on ChatGPT, but it has preferential memory access to my books. And I actually used it as a consultant writing this new book. And so I could ask this large language model, for example, it does a bang-up job of biblical interpretation, oddly enough, line by line. And I had this uncanny experience of calling on an externalized embodiment of myself to offer me advice about how to write a book I hadn't yet written based on what I knew but didn't know I knew. Because of course the large language model coding tracks the patterns of relationship between my thoughts in ways that I am not necessarily fully explicitly conscious of. And so, well, now there's an externalized me in that system, and it's analogous to me in the patterns of its thought, but it's capable of creative insights that I wouldn't necessarily have. And it's not exactly obvious to what to make of it. We also based one out on the King James Bible. And then I was thinking, well, what do we have when we have a computerized system that speaks with the spirit of the King James Bible? It's exactly what is that? What identity does that thing have? Well, you know, these are some of the things that have been plaguing me about identity in the digital world, and they're by no means all of them. Any comments you have on that, or thoughts you might have that run in parallel?
Well, there's so many different topics to address. The big picture framework that I offered for I'm talking about for 15, 18 years in different variations is this idea that in some ways we've been living in an era of relative scientific and technological stagnation since the early 1970s. There's not absolute stagnation. There's been progress in the world of bits, computers, internet, mobile internet, in recent years, the AI revolution. There's not been that much progress in the world of atoms. When I was an undergraduate at Stanford in the late 1980s, there were all these different engineering majors that would have been bad things to go into. You shouldn't become a nuclear engineer because they're not going to build any more nuclear power plants. Aeroastro was a dead-end field. Mechanical engineering, chemical engineering. Electrical engineering had a sort of afterlife, but really the only STEM-related field that even made sense to major in 1989 was computer science. And it was kind of a silly field, because anything that's called a science, I'm not against science, but things that call themselves science have an inferiority complex. And you could think computer science is roughly the same category as political science, social science, climate science. It was sort of a gut field, a dumb field, but it was the one narrow thing that at least worked on the scale of building great companies, on the sort of financial scale of people making a lot of money. And then and so I have this broad, and it's very hard. We even debate a lot of time. Am I right about the stagnation? It's not, how does one measure it? Late modernity is characterized by incredible specialization. It's like the Adam Smith had this idea of a pin factory, 100 different people building a pin. Late modernity is the pin factory on steroids. Nobody has a picture of the whole. Nobody understands what's going on. We have ever narrower groups of experts telling us how great they are. The cancer researchers tell us they will cure cancer in 5 years. They've been wrong for 50 years. Dementia, no progress whatsoever. The string theory people tell us they're the smartest people in the world. From the outside, it feels like some decaying form of postmodern literary theory at this point. But it's very, very hard to evaluate because of this hyper-specialization of knowledge. Certainly my intuitions are that there's a lot about it that's fairly fairly corrupt, fairly modest. And if we try to get at it, not in a narrow technical way where we have to spend half a lifetime understanding the science, but if we try to get at this question, how much progress has been happening, there's sort of a common sense thing that people are telling these self-serving narratives. There's an economic frame that I have, which again is a little bit too reductionist, but the economic frame is how well are people doing economically? For the first time in centuries, we have a younger generation that's doing less well than their parents. And so somehow all of this cornucopian science and technology, the Google propaganda, the university propaganda, that this art is super healthy, that we're still in this cornucopian, Baconian science project, it doesn't reflect in, if you're living in a rat-infested shoebox apartment in London, it doesn't sort of show up on this common sense level of people's living standards. And so I think broadly something has gone very wrong. There are all sorts of questions why this has happened, and I think why questions are always over-determined. Part of it is the corruption of academia. Part of it is there's a pessimistic explanation. Maybe the low-hanging fruit has been picked, and it's actually really hard to find great new breakthrough ideas. But I think there's also a part of it where, in the big picture of history, science and technology were not simply good. They had a dual-use nature, a dangerous nature. They had military applications. In some ways, the sort of cornucopian hopes of the 19th century were already shattered in 1914 in World War I, and certainly at Los Alamos. You can think about the development of the atomic bomb in 1945 as sort of, the end of science, where end of means both, the culmination and termination. We have now weapons that can destroy the world many times over. We really need to build bigger ones. And, is there maybe some sense in which you should off-ramp the project? And, we have kids no longer read adventure novels. They get brought up on a diet of Dr. Seuss. And the sort of risk-averse, hyper-environmental world that we have lived in since the 1970s, and the sort of fear of science and technology has seeped into our society. And I think this is, by the way, this is not something that's just sort of conservative moralists or vaguely anti-science, anti-tech. I think it's even more, it's even more the Hollywood left. And one of the challenges that I always have for a conservative audience that has its worries about science is that you're doing the Hollywood left does a much better job than you guys do. It's like, and my challenge is think of every science fiction movie made in the last 40, 50 years. They almost all show science that's dystopian, catastrophic. If it progresses beyond where we have now, it will be the end of humanity. It's the Matrix. It is, it's all, all kinds of dystopian AI movies, dystopian bioweapons, out of control, apocalyptic, existential risk technology. And so one way to understand this relative stagnation is that it's both, it certainly feels, it's both a feature and a bug. It's a bug that we're living in this stagnant world where nothing's happening, where the sort of middle class compact, which is always that you expect, you're in the middle class of people expect their kids to do better than themselves. This doesn't work anymore in this world of stagnation. But on the other hand, if it was simply accelerating, there is a sense this would be quite dangerous, and we don't quite know what to do. There's a way to say a few things about the AI revolution, which I think is again, if I had to sort of try to quantify this in terms of what does it mean. There are philosophical questions, but let me start just with the economic one. I think it is roughly on the scale of the internet in the late 90s. It's very big. It will have a lot of socially transformative effects. It will affect the labor market in all sorts of interesting ways. Maybe some people will be a lot more productive. Maybe other people will be replaced by computers as workers. It doesn't mean that the computers are conscious or anything like this. But on sort of an economic level, it's likely to have big repercussions. It is likely to add to modest growth in GDP, just like the internet was. The internet did not lead to cornucopia. It was better than the alternative. If we hadn't had the internet in the 90s, we would have had even more stagnation, even less growth. But I think there is something about it being in this world of bits and not atoms, where it has a feeling that it's kind of air-gapped from reality. And human beings are, we're material beings. We're in a world of matter, of stuff. We live in houses, and so there's been sort of this, one way to think about it is the world of atoms was too dangerous and got very regulated and outlawed. The world of bits, in the last 50 years, we allowed people to keep things going. It's always, I say, the FDA has very strict regulations on new drugs. If the FDA had to regulate video games, got to regulate video games like regulating drugs, it was a video game, what does it do to your brain? How much does it affect you? There would have been no progress in video game technology. But we somehow think of this virtual world as not fully decoupled, but almost totally decoupled, and it's been left, not totally unregulated, but relatively unregulated, and has sort of progressed in this somewhat autonomous way. Sometimes, of course, these two worlds come together. What happens on the internet mostly stays on the internet. Every now and then it does translate into our everyday real world, and I think something very much like this is probably the right way to think of AI. It's almost air-gapped. It's not fully air-gapped. It's going to have some pretty big repercussions. I'm so sick of the stagnation that I'm on the side that we should be willing to take the risks. We should lean into the technology. The alternative is, I don't know, you're a Starbucks barista with a PhD in English, and you are going to be stuck in your boring dead-end job for the rest of your life. And then it's no longer even scary to say the super-duper AI might kill everybody. People don't really believe that, but the alternative is that you're going to be in this sort of Groundhog Day. The 20th century is going to go on in the zombie way forever. And I think we're at a point where the 20th century is over, people are exhausted with this, and something new is going to start to happen. I often get the questions in a European context. Is the AI thing a bubble? Is it all fake? Of course, the internet, again, we're back to internet 1999. It was both very real. It was a total financial bubble. A lot of stuff blew up. It was very hard to figure out who the winners were. It didn't happen overnight. It took sort of maybe a few decades for it to really transform parts of our society. But my counterpoint to the Europeans is I don't know whether or not it's a bubble, but I know the fact that you're asking that question, and your initial questions are always so biased negatively. It tells me that Europe will have nothing to do with this technology, and it is just not going to be, it will happen in the United States, not Europe.
What do you think the consequences of externalizing our linguistic cognitive ability are going to be for our conceptions of what constitutes human identity? Particularly since the Enlightenment, we prided ourselves on our ability to think abstractly and creatively, and it's clearly the case that the large language models can duplicate much of what we consider both cognition and creativity, and already to quite a stunning degree. And so where does that leave us in terms of our conceptualization of ourself? It is quite jarring. If you had asked me, let's say, 2.5 years ago, before the real ChatGPT models got launched, or summer of 22, how would one define what it means to be a human being? And there's sort of no perfect definitions, but the sort of reductionist one I would have been tempted to go with is that human beings differ from one another in that we basically speak and from all the animals, even from apes or closest relatives or whatever, in that we have complex symbolic systems, we speak languages, we tell each other stories. The stories started as myths, they're not always true, but there's sort of a lot of complexity in this web of symbolic systems, and it's maybe it's sort of like a 3-year-old or even younger. You start to somehow get embedded in this rich symbolic matrix, and that's
radically distinctive about human identity. And you know, and just like Noam Chomsky, you know, probably did too much with linguistics and pushed the arguments too hard. But those seemed not implausible ways to think of the world in 21-22. And so yes, I think it is within that sort of a framework. It's quite disorienting, you know, what it means to be a human being. There's, you know, I think there is probably a Christian response to this, where, you know, our value in Christian, in a sort of, let's say, a classical Christian worldview doesn't have to do with language speaking ability, or, you know, your IQ. If your IQ is less than 130, you're not fully human, or something like this. It is somehow, you know, it's somehow that you're made in the image of God. There's a way that you have a kind of relationship with God, with the transcendent, with Jesus Christ, and that's sort of the way humanity gets defined. And so I think there were sort of a lot of classical humanist ways to define human beings. I think those have gotten exploded. I think in a way the more Christian ones are the only ones are ones that are still left standing. I always think there's in the philosophy of history, there's always sort of a question what Descartes was doing with his theories of dualism, and you know, sort of a mind and a body. You had these two separate kinds of things, and there are ways that we look back on Cartesianism as having you know, you're not just a material being, you're a spirit, and there's sort of ways we make it anti-materialist when we think about it in the 20th or 21st century. But I often think that maybe a critique of Descartes I have is that I believe it was a politically atheist project from the beginning, in that if you were a smart person in the 17th century, you were supposed to think about God, maybe become a priest, think about God. And it was basically, you can think of Cartesianism as a hypnotic magic trick, where he redirected your attention from God to this very mysterious thing called the mind. And it's very hard to get a handle on your mind. Obviously, there's a hard problem with consciousness. We don't quite know what it is. It's very hard to get a feel on it. But by redirecting people's attention, you know, from the external, from the transcendent God to this sort of interiority, you can spend the rest of your life in inner space. And this is kind of the trick that, in a way, I would say Descartes pulled on us, and I think there's a way that maybe we can rethink this as well. These are certainly one of the other ways that I've often framed this discussion of technological stagnation, things like this, is that you know, a part of the scientific, you know, there's always a question of the scientific technological part was complementary to Christianity, was a substitute for it. It's a complicated story of both. But it was focused on the external, the exterior world, on sort of, you know, mastery of nature, of things outside oneself, and I don't know, so a lot of signature moments one can have. But I always like to say, in July 1969, we landed on the moon, and 3 weeks later, Woodstock started, and with benefit of hindsight, that's when the hippies took over the country, and we went, and, you know, science and technology ended, and we shifted from outer space to inner space, and, you know, in all these different variations and forms, and, you know, there are things about them that are incredibly seductive, incredibly dazzling. It's in some ways a replay of what Descartes did in the 17th century. It's yoga, it's meditation, it's parapsychology, psychedelic drugs, video games. You know, it's an endless amount of these things. You could probably spend the rest of your life talking to ChatGPT, and then, you know, maybe it's probably somehow, in my mind, somehow adjacent to the narcissistic navel-gazing of identity politics too. And so there was, in all these things, you know, they had a felt sense to them where people felt like it was a way to make progress. There are good and bad things we can say about all of them. But the thing I keep coming back to is they were distractions, and they were distractions from what really mattered. And so if I go riff on, the culture wars, good things and bad things about them, I tend to be on the conservative side of the culture wars, but they were distractions from the economic question. Even just the basic real estate question in the UK, where the entire younger generation is being proletarianized and turned into communists because they can't buy houses. There are distractions from the science and technology question, and there are distractions from the real religious questions about, let's say, the God of Christianity.
Well, Peter, I'm going to have to leave it there, which is unfortunate. I would really like to delve with you into this distinction between the, say, Christian concept of the soul and the intelligence, let's say, that we now have embodied in these large language models, because that's forced us to refine our notions of what constitutes the human self in exactly the manner that you described. I'm going to turn to the panel now. I've got Jonathan Hager and Mary Harrington who are just waiting on stage. They're going to come out right away. Well, thanks to Peter very much for welcoming us today.